The world champion didn't recognize Chuck Norris and paid dearly for it on the mat, Los Angeles, California. November 3rd, 1973. A Saturday morning, 8:14 a.m. The San Fernando Valley in November has a particular quality of light that is unlike the light anywhere else in California. It comes in at a low angle through the marine layer that collects overnight against the San Gabriel Mountains and burns off slowly, and for the first 2 hours of morning, the whole valley exists in a diffuse, directionless brightness that makes the stucco buildings and the parking lots and the wide, flat commercial streets look simultaneously hyper-real and slightly provisional, as though they are all waiting to be confirmed. The smog was already building. It would be 68 degrees by noon. By 3 in the afternoon, it would be 74, and the air would taste of ozone and gasoline and the specific ambition of a city that had decided, some decades ago, that it was where everything was going to happen, and had been proving itself right ever since. The gym at the corner of Reseda Boulevard and Satakoy Street was called the California Karate and Athletic Center, which was a name that promised more than the space delivered. The building had been a tire shop in its previous life. It had high ceilings, which was useful. It had a concrete floor under the mats, which you forgot about until you fell on it incorrectly, at which point you remembered it with great specificity. It had 2 heavy bags and 1 speed bag, and a hand-painted sign above the door that read, "Champions are made here," in red letters that had faded to a color closer to rust. The sign had been there when Phil DeMarco took over the space in 1968, and he had not changed it, partly because he agreed with the sentiment, and partly because he was a man who spent his money on things that hit back. The mats themselves were worth noting. Phil had sourced them from a judo school in Gardena that had closed in 1969, and they were heavy canvas-covered foam, the old-style martial arts mat that retained impact in a way the newer foam compounds didn't quite replicate. Not punishingly, not dangerously, but with enough honest feedback that falling on them incorrectly was instructive in a direct physical way that falling on more forgiving surfaces was not. Phil believed in honest feedback. He believed the floor was a teacher, and that softening the floor's lessons was a form of dishonesty toward students. He had trained on this principle himself, and it had served him, and he extended it to everyone who used his space. There were photographs on the wall near the entrance, black and white, framed in simple black frames. Tournament photographs, mostly. Regional events from the late 1960s and early 1970s. Groups of people in GIs and tournament brackets and the stiff smiling that people do when they are still pumped with adrenaline and being asked to be. Still for a camera. Phil appeared in several of them. Younger, thinner, in the way that young people are thin before training fills them out rather than in. In several photographs, there were other people. Faces that those who followed the circuit would have recognized. Faces that even serious practitioners outside the West Coast tournament world might not have known. In one photograph, near the top of the arrangement, there was a man standing beside Phil at what appeared to be the 1969 PKA regional tournament. The man was wearing a black GI top and a relaxed expression and was perhaps an inch or 2 taller than Phil, with the specific physical quality of someone at the end of a very long day of competition, a quality of settled exhaustion that is particular to people who have been using their bodies at high intensity and are now coming down from it. The man's name, written in Phil's handwriting on a small white card beneath the frame, was Chuck, James Cooper. On his way through the entrance that Saturday morning, had glanced at the photograph without reading the card and moved onto the mat. This was not carelessness. He had glanced at every photograph. It was his habit, entering a new gym, to read the room in the literal sense, to understand whose space he was entering and what history the walls held. He had processed the photograph as Phil DeMarco, Regional 1969 Tournament, another competitor. He had not read the card. He had been in a hurry to get to the floor and warm up, which is itself a small lesson in how much information we routinely fail to receive, because we are already in motion toward what we expect to find. Phil DeMarco had been training serious martial artists in the Valley since 1966. Not famous ones, mostly. He had no Hollywood clients, no celebrities, no names that generated magazine coverage. What he had were men and women who came in before work and after work and on Saturday mornings and put in honest hours on the floor, and the floor didn't care about their names, and neither did Phil. He was a third-degree black belt in Kenpo, had competed briefly in the early tournament circuit, and decided that what he liked more than competing was teaching, which is the decision that separates certain kinds of men from certain other kinds of men and tells you something important about which kind they are. On this particular Saturday morning, the gym held 4 people. 2 of them were Phil, DeMarco's regular Saturday students, a machinist named Tony Ferrara, who had been training for 3 years and had the particular combination of mechanical intelligence and physical stubbornness that makes for a reliable, if unspectacular, practitioner, and a college student named Lisa Park, who had been training for 8 months and was progressing at the kind of rate that happens when natural physical intelligence meets genuine commitment to form. They were warming up in the far corner. working through basic combinations at half speed, giving the movements the deliberate attention of people who understand that slow is where precision lives before it becomes speed. The third person was a man named James Whitfield Cooper. The fourth was Chuck Norris. James Whitfield Cooper was 23 years old, and he was the current United States East Coast Open Karate Championship middleweight title holder. And he had been in Los Angeles for 6 days, and he had been wrong about something for most of those 6 days, and he did not yet know he was wrong about it. This is the story of how he found out. James Cooper had grown up in Baltimore, Maryland, the oldest son of a postman named Henry Cooper, who worked the Federal Hill route 6 days a week for 22 years without calling in sick, and who held the following beliefs in roughly equal regard: that hard work was its own reward, that showing weakness was a choice, and that the Baltimore Colts were the only professional football team worth caring about. He had raised his son accordingly, which is to say that James Cooper had been raised to be someone who showed up, who put in the work, and who expected that showing up and putting in the work would be enough. For most of James Cooper's first 23 years, this expectation had been validated. He had started karate at 15 at a school in South Baltimore, run by a Korean-American instructor named Master David Kim, who taught taekwondo, due with a rigor that satisfied Henry Cooper's sensibilities, and a competitive emphasis that satisfied his son's growing need to test what he was building. James was a natural athlete, long-limbed, quick, with a kinesthetic intelligence that absorbed technique rapidly and deployed it with a fluency that surprised his teachers. He made black belt at 18. He began competing seriously at 19. At 20, he won his first major regional tournament. At 21, he won the AS Mid-Atlantic Open. At 22, he won the East Coast Open for the first time. At 23, he won it again. He was, by any reasonable assessment, a genuinely excellent martial artist. What Master David Kim had given him in 8 years of intensive instruction was the real thing, not the diluted, performance-oriented version of Taekwondo that had begun to appear in some of the franchise schools opening across the country in the early 1970s, but the actual martial discipline as it had been transmitted from Korea. Rigorous in its foundational practice, honest about what worked and what didn't, serious in its approach to the student as a complete person who was developing not just physical skill, but character, judgment, and the specific courage that comes from having been tested repeatedly at the edge of one's capacity and having not broken. Master Kim was not a soft teacher. He was a demanding teacher in the specific way of Korean martial arts instructors of his generation, demanding of effort, demanding of precision, demanding of honesty. He did not praise what didn't deserve praise, and he did not withhold praise from what did. He told his students the truth about their progress in the same tone he told them the truth about their failures, which was the most effective way he knew to make both pieces of information equally receivable. He had tried, in his way, to tell James Cooper about the thing with the inside enemy. He had said it in different formulations over the years: the opponent in the mirror, the contest that precedes the contest, the ego that masks itself as confidence. James had received these formulations in the way that intelligent young athletes sometimes receive wisdom that applies to a future version of themselves rather than to who they are right now, with genuine acknowledgement, with the nod of a person who understands something intellectually, without the full embodied reception that only happens when the wisdom becomes personally necessary. He had filed it away in the category of things his teacher said that were probably true. He had come to Los Angeles because the West Coast was where the serious money and tournament karate was moving, where the major promoters were, where the next level of competition was. He had come with a specific ambition: to establish himself in the West Coast circuit the following year, to compete at the Professional Karate Association level, to see how he matched up against the men who occupied the top tier of American martial arts competition. He had come with a record that justified the ambition and with the confidence that the record had earned. He had also come with a gap in his knowledge that was about to cost him something. The gap was this: James Cooper had come up entirely within the East Coast regional circuit, training with East Coast teachers, competing against East Coast fighters, reading the East Coast martial arts press, which covered East Coast martial arts and covered the West Coast the way a local newspaper covers events in the next state, cursorily, without the granular detail that creates real familiarity. He knew the big names of American karate. He knew the names the magazines put on covers. He knew Chuck Norris the way a college basketball player knows the name of the greatest player from the previous decade, as a name attached to a reputation, a statistic, a category, rather than a specific man with a specific face that he would recognize in a gym at 8 in the morning. He had been introduced to Phil DeMarco through a connection, a promoter in Philadelphia who knew DeMarco from the tournament circuit, and had told James that if he was going to be in LA for a week, he should get some floor time in, and DeMarco's gym was where you did it if you were serious. James had called. DeMarco had been immediately welcoming in the way that serious martial artists are, welcoming to other serious martial artists, The fraternity of people who have chosen a difficult path extends across geographic and stylistic boundaries and recognizes itself on contact. "Come in Saturday morning," DeMarco had said. "We'll get you some time on the floor." James arrived at 8 a.m. He introduced himself to Phil, changed, warmed up. Phil introduced him to Tony and Lisa. The fourth person in the gym, the man who was already on the floor when James arrived, already in the middle of a form James didn't immediately recognize, moving through it with a quality of focus so complete it was almost private. Phil had introduced as Chuck. "Chuck," James had said, extending his hand. "Chuck," the man had confirmed, shaking it. "Medium height, 5'10", 5'11", lean, the kind of physical condition that doesn't announce itself. Brown hair cut short, eyes that were quiet and direct without being aggressive. "In from the East Coast," James had said. "Welcome," Chuck had said. They had exchanged the brief, neutral courtesies of martial artists meeting for the first time and had then gone to their respective sections of the floor. The name Chuck, just Chuck, no surname, Phil had offered no further introduction, existed in James's inventory as the name of a local practitioner, one of the gym regulars, probably competent, probably not someone who would give him much trouble if they sparred. This is the particular mechanism of the gap in James. Cooper's knowledge. It was not that he was arrogant. He was not, fundamentally, an arrogant person. He was a person who had worked very hard and achieved genuine success and had consequently developed a model of the world in which certain equations held. The level of a martial artist could be roughly assessed from his bearing, his movement, and his credentials. And credentials were things that got mentioned. You introduced yourself with your context. If this quiet man named Chuck were anyone of note in the West Coast circuit, the introduction would have contained more. Phil DeMarco seemed like a man who respected context. He would have said more. James Cooper had made a logical inference from incomplete data. The inference was wrong. The data was incomplete because Chuck Norris, standing in that gym at 8 on a Saturday morning in a pair of training shorts and a plain white t-shirt, did not carry his credentials in any visible form. He carried something else, that quality, which James had noticed but had not yet properly interpreted, of complete self-sufficiency. The quality of a person who has long since stopped needing the room to know who he is. Phil DeMarco, for his part, had not provided a fuller introduction because it had not occurred to him that one was necessary. In his world, the world of the Southern California martial arts community, introducing Chuck Norris as Chuck Norris was like introducing the Pacific Ocean as a large body of water. The name and the identity were inseparable, and the identity was known. That a young champion from Baltimore might not connect the name to the face, to the 6 consecutive world titles, was a possibility that simply had not entered Phil DeMarco's construction of the morning. They trained separately for the first 45 minutes. James worked through his forms and his shadow combinations and some bag work, getting loose, feeling out the floor and the space. He was good, to watch even in warm-up. The fluency was real. The East Coast schools had given him sound technique, and the natural athleticism was obvious. Tony Ferrara, taking a water break, watched James work the heavy bag for a few minutes with the evaluative attention of a man who spends enough time around martial artists to have a calibrated sense of the real. He thought, this kid is the real deal. Phil DeMarco, also watching, had a more complex thought. He had seen Chuck Norris train hundreds of times. He knew what it looked like when someone was genuinely good. He also knew, having watched James Cooper for 45 minutes, that James Cooper was genuinely good. He had the thought, not for the first time in his career as a gym owner, that the floor was about to teach somebody something. Chuck, during this time, had finished his forms and moved to the heavy bag at the far end of the gym. He worked it differently than James had worked it, not less powerfully, but with a different economy, each strike arriving with the full weight of the body behind it through a transfer of energy so efficient it was almost invisible. The way the most effective machines are the ones that eliminate superfluous movement rather than adding complexity. He wasn't working for speed. He was working for something deeper. The integration that comes after speed has been achieved and can be assumed. At around 9 o'clock, Phil suggested open sparring. Light contact, he said. Oh, work on your movement, your distance, nothing heavy. James paired with Tony first. Tony was 3 years in and genuinely solid. He had good defense, good footwork, and he didn't get rattled. James worked him respectfully, not going near full capacity, pulling everything well back, working combinations in the 60% range and using the exchange to calibrate his distance and timing on the California floor. He was good with Tony. He was smooth and controlled, and he could feel himself coming up to temperature. Then Phil said, "Chuck, you want to work with James?" Chuck said, "Sure." They squared off in the center of the mat. James Cooper looked at the man across from him, this quiet man named Chuck, about his height, maybe 10 years older, in good shape but not remarkable shape, and made his assessment. He had been making assessments like this for 6 years of serious competition. He was good at them. His assessment said, experienced, probably solid, probably a good workout, probably not a significant challenge. His assessment was going to need revision. He came forward with his opening combination, the sequence he always started with when working someone new, designed to produce information rather than damage. A jab, cross, front kick at 70%. The kind of combination that tells you what you need to know about an opponent's reflexes, his comfort with distance, the quality of his defense. It was a good combination. Everything James Cooper threw was a good combination. The jab found air, not because Chuck had moved much, because Chuck had moved enough, exactly enough, in the direction that made the jab miss by the minimum necessary margin. The cross came in behind the jab, and Chuck was already inside it, inside James's range, in the space between where the strike was going and where the striker's body was, and there was a deflection. Not a block, something more subtle, a rerouting of James's momentum that used the momentum rather than opposing it, and James was off balance for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, Chuck was back outside his range and the moment had passed. James reset. He breathed. He recalibrated. He came again. He was a smart fighter. He didn't repeat. He varied his rhythm, his distance, his angle of entry. He tried to find the pattern in how Chuck moved, the tell that would give him the lane. For the next 3 minutes, he worked through his best techniques with real craft, with the genuine skill of a current national champion, and he found something he had not found in a very long time. He found nothing. Not that Chuck was doing spectacular things. He was not. He was not leaping and spinning, not executing dramatic techniques, not demonstrating anything that would look impressive on a highlight reel. He was doing something far more unsettling. He was never where James intended him to be. The distance was wrong in a way. That felt like James's own error, but wasn't. It was being managed from the outside with such subtle precision that it looked like James was misjudging things rather than having them adjusted around him. And twice in those 3 minutes, Chuck did something. Once he turned James's own momentum into a position that left James completely open, not for a strike that Chuck then threw, he didn't throw it, but for a moment of pure exposure that was somehow more educational than a strike would have been, because it said, I was here and you were open, and I am showing you that I chose not to. The second time was a controlled takedown, a classical judo throw executed so cleanly that James found himself on the mat before his nervous system had registered that the throw had begun. He got up. He stood for a moment. He looked at the man across from him. In James Cooper's competitive career, no one had ever put him on the mat in the first 3 minutes of a sparring session. He had been in close matches. He had been hit hard. He had been hurt. He had lost on points when he felt he shouldn't have. But this, the matter-of-fact ease of it, the absence of drama, the way it had happened as though it were the most natural thing in the world. This was different. This had the quality of a statement made by someone who didn't need to raise their voice. He looked at this man named Chuck. Something in the way Chuck was standing. Patient, still, returning. James's look, without challenge or display, completed a circuit in James Cooper's brain. Something that had been in there, unconnected. A name, a reputation, a face he had seen in a photograph somewhere, in a magazine, in the circulation of tournament circuit lore, assembled itself. The jaw, the stillness, the particular economy of movement that was not technique, but something prior to technique, the way a river doesn't have a technique for flowing downhill. Wait, James said. Chuck waited. Norris? James said. Not a question exactly. An arrival. Chuck looked at him. Yeah, he said. James stood on the mat in Phil DeMarco's gym in Reseda with that feeling, the feeling of a room getting very quiet, the feeling of the ground confirming itself. He replayed the last 3 minutes. He replayed the introduction in the doorway. Just Chuck. Welcome. The form he had been working through when James arrived. Norris had developed Chun Cook Do based on Tang Soo Do. James had read about this. He had read the phrase 6 consecutive world titles in 3 different publications without it meaning anything particular because it was the past and James Cooper was in the present. He had been in the same room as the 6 consecutive world titles and had seen a man named Chuck warming up before a Saturday sparring session. You didn't say your name, James said. Phil just said Chuck. Phil knows who I am, Chuck said. I don't usually... He paused. I didn't realize... You didn't know. James laughed. It was not a comfortable laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes out when the alternative is something less manageable. I came from Baltimore, he said. East Coast Open champion. I came out here to see where I stand against the West Coast guys. He paused. I thought you were a local. I live in the Valley, Chuck said. That's local. You know what I mean? Yeah, Chuck said. I do. They stood on the mat. Tony Ferrara and Lisa Park had stopped their own work and were watching with the specific attention of people who understand that something instructive is happening. Phil DeMarco leaned against the far wall with his arms crossed, watching, and his expression was that of a man who has been waiting for this moment without knowing he was waiting for it. "The throw," James said. "The judo throw. I didn't see it coming at all." "You were thinking about your next attack," Chuck said. "You were a little ahead of yourself." "I'm usually better than that." "You were nervous?" Chuck said. "You came here to test yourself against the West Coast guys. That made you press. Pressing narrows your vision." James Cooper looked at him. The observation was accurate, and the accuracy of it had the particular sting that accurate observations have when you would have preferred to be seen less clearly. "I did the same thing," Chuck said. "My first major tournament, 1964. I went in thinking about what I needed to prove and spent the whole match trying to execute a plan instead of responding to what was actually in front of me. Lost in the semifinals. Went home and trained for 4 months before I competed again." "What changed?" James said. Chuck was quiet for a moment. He looked at the floor, then back at James. "I stopped competing against the idea of the opponent," he said. "I started competing against the actual person in front of me." He paused. "Sounds simple." "It doesn't feel simple," James said. "I know," Chuck said. "It doesn't." They sparred for another 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, something changed in the character of the exchange. James stopped pressing. He stopped trying to execute a plan. He started, haltingly, not completely, but genuinely, trying to respond to what was actually in front of him, and what was in front of him was Chuck Norris, who was extraordinarily difficult to read and extraordinarily difficult to hit, and who, as the exchange extended, began showing James things that James could not have asked for directly because he hadn't known he needed them. He was shown, through the physical vocabulary of contact sport, what the discipline of staying in the present moment actually meant as a bodily practice rather than a philosophical concept. He was shown the difference between confidence and certainty, confidence being the earned capacity to act without guarantees, certainty being the premature closing of the aperture that receives new information. He was shown what 33 years of dedicated practice looked like from the inside of an exchange with it. Not superhuman, not invulnerable, but relentlessly calibrated, relentlessly present, relentlessly honest in its assessment of what was happening in real time. At one point, about 25 minutes into the extended session, Chuck landed a controlled kick. A side kick pulled perhaps 40%, enough to communicate itself without damage, that James did not see coming until it was already there. James stepped back, absorbed it, nodded. "I didn't see that at all," James said. "You were watching my hands," Chuck said. "That's where attacks come from." "Often," Chuck said. "Not always. The kick came from your left side, from a stance shift you weren't tracking. And when you're watching for the specific thing you expect, you stop seeing the things you don't expect." James worked this into himself. He filed it in the place where things that change practice live, not in the place where things that make good conversation live. "Is that what you teach?" James said. "In your school?" "Used to teach more directly," Chuck said. "I had schools in the 60s, early 70s. Before the films." He paused. "What I taught, what I tried to teach, was attention without preference. You watch everything with equal weight. The hand, the shoulder, the stance, the eyes. You don't bet on one thing." James nodded. Then he said, "Because it was in him, and he was not a man who managed his candor very well when he was in the middle of actual learning. How do you not bet on one thing when you've beaten everyone you've ever faced?" Chuck looked at him. The question landed, and Chuck received it without deflecting it, without the false modesty that many champions deploy, and without the genuine arrogance that some others do. "I haven't beaten everyone," he said. "I've lost important matches. Early on, I lost often enough to learn what losing meant." He paused. "And the titles? I was the 6-time champion starting in 1968. Before that, I was the guy who wasn't. Before that, I was a kid from Oklahoma who learned karate in Korea because he needed something to hold on to, and the base had a dojo." He looked at James with that direct, unmanaged gaze. "The certainty thing, the thing you came in here with this morning, I had that too. I had it for years. Some days I still have traces of it. The work is to notice it when it comes up and put it down." James Cooper was 23 years old, and he was listening with the quality of attention that only arrives when you have been brought through physical reality to the place where you are finally ready to hear something you have been adjacent to for years without actually receiving it. "My teacher," he said, "Master Kim in Baltimore, he used to say the first enemy is the one inside." "Good teacher," Chuck said. I nodded when he said it. James said. "I thought I understood it." "You understand it better now than you did this morning." "Yeah," James said. "I do." They sat down on the mat. Just sat, the way people sit when the formal structure of training has resolved into something less formal and more honest, and they talked for a while. Phil DeMarco brought water. Tony and Lisa, having completed their own session, sat nearby with the unobtrusive attentiveness of people who understand they are in the vicinity of something that matters. They talked about competition, specifically about the transition James was considering from the East Coast Regional Circuit to the Professional Karate Association, and what that transition would actually require. Chuck spoke about this with the particular authority of someone who had been at the top of that specific structure and had watched it from the inside, and what he said was not discouraging and not cheerleading. It was accurate. He said the West Coast competition was technically strong, and that James had the foundation to compete at that level, but that the mental adjustment would be as demanding as the physical one. He said that the East Coast Regional Circuit, for all its seriousness, was a closed system. The same people, the same styles, the same patterns, and that the PCA circuit would show James things about his own game that the East Coast circuit had never forced him to confront. He said this without condescension. He said it with the straightforwardness of a man who is telling you the truth about the road because he thinks you can handle the truth and because giving you a comfortable lie would be a form of disrespect. James listened. He asked questions. Some of the questions were technical, about specific aspects of the PCA format, about particular fighters James would face, about training adjustments. Some of the questions were less technical and more essential, about how to maintain hunger without desperation, about what happens when you get to the top and discover the top is not a stable place to stand, about the relationship between ambition and peace. Chuck answered all of them with the same quality of attention. He did not lecture. He responded to what was actually being asked, which is the hardest thing in teaching. The discipline to answer the question that was posed rather than the question you would prefer to have been posed. At some point, around 10:30 a.m., the San Fernando Valley outside now in full morning, the smog thickening, the light losing its diffuse quality and becoming direct and California-specific. Phil DeMarco made coffee on the small machine he kept in the corner of the office space, and they drank it on the mat, all of them, which was not the usual way of things at the California Karate and Athletic Center, but which felt, on that morning, like the exactly right way. Lisa Park, who had been silent throughout, said to Chuck, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," Chuck said. "When you were competing," she said. She was 22, 8 months into her training, still finding the contours of what she was building. "When you were the champion, did you ever stop being afraid?" The question surprised James, who had not thought to ask it. He looked at Chuck. Chuck held his coffee cup. He looked at it for a moment, as though reading something in it. "No," he said finally. "But the fear changed character." He paused. "Early on, the fear was about losing, about what losing would mean, about what the people watching would think." He looked at Lisa. "Later, the fear was simpler, more like responsibility, being responsible to the thing I'd been given. When the training, the teachers, the students, when you carry something that other people gave to you and that other people are depending on you to carry well, there's a kind of fear in that too. But it's a cleaner fear. It's not about you." Lisa nodded slowly. James nodded too, because the answer was not about women or men or beginners or champions. It was about something earlier and more fundamental than any category. "That's what I came from Oklahoma to Korea to get," Chuck said. "I didn't know it at the time. I thought I was learning how to fight, but what the dojo gave me, what Master Kim's teacher gave you, is a way to be afraid of the right things." He finished his coffee. He set the cup down. He got to his feet with the ease of a man whose body knows how to move and does it without commentary. "Good session," he said. He meant it as a general statement, not a compliment to James specifically, not a compliment to the gym or to Phil, but a statement of fact about what the morning had been. A good session. A session that had produced something. He shook Phil's hand, then Tony's, then Lisa's. He shook James Cooper's hand last, and when he did, he looked at him with that direct, quiet attention. "You're going to be good in this circuit," he said, "when you get here." "I made a fool of myself this morning," James said. "You made an assumption this morning," Chuck said. "Then you let go of it when it turned out to be wrong. That's the opposite of foolishness." He left the gym. They heard his car start in the parking lot, heard it pull out onto Reseda Boulevard, heard it fade into the ordinary sound of a Saturday morning in the San Fernando Valley. The four. People left in the gym sat with the specific silence of a room after something has happened in it. That residual charge, that sense of the air still holding the shape of what had been there. Tony Ferrara spoke first. "That was Chuck Norris," he said, in the tone of someone confirming a mathematical result. Yeah, Phil DeMarco said. I've trained here for 3 years, and I've seen him in here maybe 15 times, Tony said. He never talks that much. Phil nodded. He looked at James. Cooper. You earned it, he said. James looked at him. He talks to people who are actually listening, Phil said. You were actually listening. Some people who come in here and realize they're sparring with Chuck Norris. He paused. They shut down, or they get ego defensive. You stayed on the mat, and you worked, and you asked real questions. James Cooper looked at the mat. He was thinking about the throw, the judo throw that he hadn't seen coming, the floor coming up to meet him, the moment of complete reorientation. He was thinking about what Chuck had said. You were a little ahead of yourself. He was thinking about what he had come to Los Angeles to find out and what he had actually found out, which were not the same thing, but which were more valuable than what he had come looking for. I need to train differently, James said. Not to Phil, not to anyone specifically, just as a declaration, a statement of the thing he had just understood. Yeah, Phil said. Probably. James drove back to his motel in Burbank. He sat in the parking lot for a while in his car with the window down and the valley air coming in, smelling of oleander and exhaust. He called his teacher, Master David Kim, in Baltimore. It was past noon on the East Coast. Master Kim answered on the third ring. How's California? Master Kim said. Different, James said. I sparred with Chuck Norris this morning. A pause. How did that go? He put me on the mat inside the first 2 minutes. Another pause. When Master Kim spoke again, his voice had something in it that James recognized after a moment as satisfaction. The quiet, deep satisfaction of a teacher whose student has encountered something the teacher has been trying to provide for years. Tell me what happened, Master Kim said. James told him. He told him about the introduction, about the assumption, about the 3 minutes of finding nothing, about the throw and the mat and the quiet. Realization. He told him about the conversation afterward, the fear and the right things, the attention without preference, the actual person versus the idea of the opponent. He told it in the unhurried way that you tell things when you are telling them to understand them rather than to perform the telling. Master Kim listened without interrupting. When James finished, Master Kim was quiet for a moment. The first enemy is the one inside, Master Kim said. I know, James said. I know you used to say that. I used to say it, Master Kim said. You used to nod. James laughed. It was a better laugh than the one on the mat. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I did. He returned to Baltimore a week later. He trained differently, not in any single observable way, not in a way that would have been immediately visible to someone watching from outside, but in a way that his body knew and that his sparring partners noticed within the first few sessions. He was less ahead of himself. He was more there, more in the actual exchange rather than in the plan for the exchange. Tony Ferrara's phrase, he was actually listening, applied now to his body as well as his mind, to the physical vocabulary of contact and distance and timing that good martial arts is conducted in. He competed in the West Coast Circuit for the first time in March 1974. He won his division. Not easily. There was a match in the semifinals against a Los Angeles-based Kenpo practitioner named Marcus Webb, who pushed him to the final points and who, in his focused aggression and physical intelligence, reminded James more than a little of himself 6 months earlier. But he won it with a combination of technical skill and mental quality that his teacher, Master Kim, watching on a connection that Phil DeMarco had arranged, Phil liked to see things through, would later say was the best he had ever seen James compete. He did not make it to the top of the PCA circuit. Competitive careers are rarely shaped as cleanly as ambitions. He won consistently at the higher regional level, placed in the top 3 at 2 national events, and built a record that, while not as singular as the one he had dreamed about, was genuinely impressive and genuinely earned. There was a match in the 1975 National Circuit at a major tournament in Dallas that illustrated what had changed. James had drawn a strong opponent in the quarterfinals, a California practitioner named Rafael Soto, who was technically accomplished and physically aggressive and who fought in a style designed to impose its tempo on the exchange, to make the match happen at Soto's preferred distance and rhythm. The old James, the James who had walked into Phil DeMarco's gym, certain of his own calibration, would have fought Soto's tempo, would have tried to impose his own preferred structure in return, creating the kind of grinding technical contest that produces a winner and a loser, but does not produce revelation. The new James, the James who had been slightly moved, who had changed the aperture through which information entered, fought what was actually in front of him. He let Soto set the initial tempo. He received Soto's rhythm and worked within it for 2 minutes, gathering information, feeling the actual specifics of this actual opponent rather than the theoretical category of aggressive tempo imposer. Then he did something Soto had not prepared for, He found the gap in Soto's specific rhythm, not the gap in the general pattern of aggressive fighters, but the particular irregularity in Rafael Soto's specific movement, a fractional hesitation before a rear hand combination that Soto used as his primary finisher. And he entered that gap with the timing of a man who was actually there rather than ahead of himself. He won the match on points. In the post-game interview, a tournament reporter asked him about his strategy. He said, "I tried to actually watch him." The reporter wrote it down without quite knowing what to make of it. By 1977, he had redirected his attention primarily toward teaching, opening a school in Baltimore that, within 5 years, had over 80 students and a tournament record that made Master David Kim, visiting in 1982, sit in the back of the dojo and watch the students practice with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to see his work continue in someone else. "You're teaching them the thing," Master Kim said afterward. "Which thing?" James said. Master Kim looked at him. The question was, in its way, a test, and James knew it. "Attention without preference," James said, "being with the actual opponent rather than the idea of the opponent." Master Kim nodded. "Yes," he said, "that thing. I learned it in one morning," James said. "It took me 4 years to actually understand it." "Understanding things takes as long as it takes," Master Kim said. "The learning is a seed. The understanding is what grows from it." Chuck Norris returned to Phil DeMarco's gym the following Saturday, as he often did on Saturday mornings when he was in the Valley and didn't have a training commitment elsewhere. Phil asked him if he remembered the kid from Baltimore. "East Coast champion," Chuck said. "Cooper." "James Cooper. Yeah," Phil said. "He's going to compete on the West Coast next spring." Chuck nodded. He was pulling on his training gloves. "He's good," Chuck said. "He said you put him on the mat in 2 minutes." "He recovered well," Chuck said. He pulled the second glove on and flexed his hand to seat it. "That's the thing. Not that he went down, that he got up and kept working?" Phil nodded. He had run a gym for 7 years, and he had seen a great many people go down and a significant number not get up, not in the essential sense, the sense of remaining present to what the floor was telling them. "He heard you," Phil said. Chuck looked at him. "He heard himself," Chuck said. "I just made enough noise that he could." He went to the floor. He began his forms. The day settled around him in the particular way that Saturday mornings in the Valley settle, the light coming through the high windows at its low November angle, the sound of Reseda Boulevard outside, Tony Ferrara arriving 15 minutes later and starting his warm-up, the ordinary choreography of an ordinary morning in a gym where champions are made, according to the faded sign, though what is meant by champions and what is meant by made are questions the sign does not attempt to answer. The floor does, though, every morning. In the slow, specific language of footwork and contact and the patient accumulation of hours, the floor answers both questions at once, and if you are actually listening, if you are attending without preference, if you are with the thing rather than ahead of it, you can hear exactly what it says. James Cooper heard it. In Baltimore, in his school on Saturday mornings while his students moved through their forms, he passed it on, that particular quality of presence, that education of the nervous system, that hard-won understanding of where the actual opponent lives. He passed it on without ever mentioning a quiet man named Chuck in a gym in Reseda, because it was not a story that needed to be told. It was a thing that needed to be practiced, and in the practicing, it continued. The way rivers continue, without knowing where they started, without needing to. The photograph on Phil DeMarco's wall, the one from the 1969 regional tournament, the one with the small white card that said Chuck in Phil's handwriting, stayed there for as long as Phil ran the gym, which was until 1991, when he retired and sold the space to a young man from Hawthorne who wanted to open an aerobics studio and who, standing in the empty space that had formerly been the California Karate and Athletic Center, looked at the photographs on the wall and asked Phil who all these people were. Phil told him. He told him about the tournaments and the fighters and the specific character of that era in American karate, when the art was still being invented in its American form and the people inventing it were doing so with the seriousness and the commitment and the occasional blind spots of people who are working at the edge of what has been done before. He told him about the photograph of Chuck. He told it briefly, without embellishment, the way serious things deserve to be told. The aerobics studio man nodded politely. He had not heard of Chuck Norris in this context. He had heard of him from the films, from Walker, Texas Ranger, from the television landscape of the late 1980s and early 1990s. He had not known that this famous man from the television had once been, before all of that, a man who showed up on Saturday mornings at a former tire shop in Reseda and moved through his forms in the early light because the forms were the floor and the floor was the foundation, and the foundation was what everything else was built on. Phil took the photographs down carefully before he handed the space over. He kept them. He kept them in a box in the garage of the house in Woodland Hills where he lived with his wife, and sometimes, in the particular way that retired men look at evidence of their working lives, he took the box out and looked through. It, and the photographs looked back at him from the specific time they contained, patient and unrevised, exactly what they had been. Los Angeles, California, November 1973.